In a 9-year reign of terror, the bodies of 23 young men are dumped along isolated tracks and waterways in deepest Louisiana.
He would cruise, go to areas where street people, hustlers would frequent.
Just the number of victims is the hardest thing.
When a suspect emerges, he's far from the image of a violent man.
This is a serial killer you've never heard of.
There was really nothing we overlooked that would have identified him as a suspect.
As the list of victims grows ever longer, detectives face a race against time to stop a killer in his tracks. What will it take to prove his guilt? Which part of the puzzle will reveal the killer's mistake? "19-year-old David Lavon Mitchell had been hitchhiking home from a wedding in St. Charles's Parish when he disappeared. 2 days later, his body was found on an abandoned stretch of highway. 5 months later, and just 6 miles away, another body, Gary Pierre, 20 years old.
Discarded near a trash bin, a trash dumpster.
While Mitchell's death was at first dismissed as accidental, Pierre's body raised more suspicion. A postmortem showed that he had been tied up shortly before his death.
Initially, the first one, we had no idea that we were dealing with, something larger. We worked it as trying to identify the victim, where did he come from? Then we had a second one that was kind of similar. The victims were similar, in age.
7 months later, less than 5 miles from where Gary Pierre was discovered, 38-year-old Larry Ranson's remains were found.
Placed on the ground outside of the same type of, trash dumpster. The bodies were disposed of where they were going to be found. The next morning, someone would have seen them.
Police officers noted other similarities. Like the second victim, Ransom was homeless and heavily involved with drugs. No one had reported either man missing. But with Ransom, there was something new. He'd been savagely beaten. An autopsy suggested he'd fought hard against his killer. This was a death that could not be written off as an unfortunate accident. And as the sheriff's office launched an investigation, the bodies kept coming, thick and fast. All were found abandoned on industrial sites or wasteland in Jefferson Parish, an hour's drive or so from the first set of victims. Some of the bodies showed signs of sexual assault. They had been bound or restrained, with asphyxiation the most likely cause of death.
The physical evidence, the hair fibers or anything like that, that stuff was all collected during autopsy and on the scene. We knew we had, several DNA profiles developed, from the Jefferson Parish cases. Mitochondrial DNA, which is hair, you can get it off of there, and then the nuclear DNA, which is, seminal fluid off of one of the victims here in the city of Kenner. But he wasn't in the system.
At first, there was little uproar in the semi-rural communities where the victims' remains were found.
He killed people who were marginalized. He killed people who lived a high-risk lifestyle and didn't necessarily garner a lot of sympathy from people outside their family.
But as homicide investigations sought out links between the deceased men, local journalists were also beginning to look for patterns, like Homer native Dee Thurston.
He seemed to like black men, slight black men. They, not big brawny guys, but lean,
Most were homeless or down on their luck. They had criminal records, or they were addicted to drugs.
Basically, invisible people. The ones that you drive by and you look at and you give no second thought other than say, look at that bump.
These weren't guys who had their own way to get around. They're walking at between 10 and 2 in the morning. They're getting in a truck with some stranger.
Detectives were also struck by a curious similarity between the victims' remains. Despite the youth and stature of the murdered men, autopsy reports suggested most had been killed without much of a fight.
No defensive wounds or no evidence of a big struggle. Because some of these people were decent-sized men, even though they were young at age, they were pretty much tall and big in stature, some of them.
Profilers theorized that the perpetrator was a large, strong man, someone with the menace or power to subdue his victims. They had no idea the prime suspect who would one day emerge bore no resemblance to this mythical killer. Misfit Ronald Dominique attracted little attention as he lived quietly amongst the communities that he terrorized.
Well, we found out basically that he was a loner. He lived in a trailer on his sister's property. And going back, we found out that, in high school, didn't really have any friends.
Lawyer Richard C. Gawley would become well acquainted with the character and background of Ronald Dominique.
When we go investigate people, we go back and try to find out people that knew him when he was growing up, teachers, people he worked for, whoever he may have come in contact with. And we found with Dominique really didn't have any long-lasting friends, teachers that really took to him.
He came from an impoverished background. His parents were poor.
Lower income, lived in a trailer in Bayou Blue, just regular, everyday working folk.
He was of low intellect. He didn't have a good education.
He grew up in Lafourche Parish. He went to Thibodaux High School. He was not a popular guy. My understanding is that he didn't come to terms with his homosexuality until late in his teens. I'm told that he was bullied, so high school was rough for him.
Bullying and confusion about his sexual identity was only a part of Dominique's story. His family history was traumatic.
Dominique's father suspected his mother of having an affair. So the father gathered up Dominique and his sister and drove them to the mother's brother's house. And they burst in and found the mother and her brother in bed together, obviously having sexual relationships.
Investigators would one day hear that despite their complex relationship, after graduating from high school in 1983, Dominique continued to rely on his mother for support.
He always lived with either his mom or his older sister.
He didn't amount to much of anything other than he worked in some kind of labor-intensive menial job, working in a supply business.
He had a bad attitude.
He felt that he was inferior. Couldn't get a girlfriend or boyfriend. He was kind of a little overweight.
He was just really aimless life. No friends, no one to be in love with or to love him.
Eventually, Ronald Dominique grew confident enough to acknowledge his sexuality. According to Dee Dee Thurston, who has acquaintances in common with Dominique, his presence in Thibodaux gay bars was not altogether welcomed.
Even when he came out of the closet and was part of the gay scene, he really wasn't accepted there either.
I would imagine just because you're gay doesn't mean that other people will find you attractive. Other gay people will find you attractive, which apparently they didn't. He was short and obese, sickly, non-threatening, shy, or at least standoffish, tend to complain some about his situation, whether it be his surroundings or the food that he's given, that sort of thing. Totally non-threatening. Obviously someone that you would picture being picked on. Not only because of his sexual orientation, but because of his physical attributes. and someone that really had, I don't want to say he had no redeeming qualities, but he was, nothing about him really stood out. He was sometimes just referred to as a gray person. He just fit into the background.
Investigators would be told by those familiar with the Thibodaux gay scene that the only time Dominique came alive was when he was up on stage.
His favorite thing was being a female impersonator.
He liked to dress up like Patti LaBelle and imitate her, but he wasn't very good at it.
Criminologist Dr. Brian Frederick believes that Dominique's social activities give a tantalizing hint into what made him tick and how he got his kicks.
This female impersonation, this act, where he was inviting others to laugh at him, he's in control of that. This is a marker. Control is a marker. And we know that with the serial rapes, rape has nothing to do with love or affection or intimacy or sex. It's a control issue. And yeah, the trappings of it were there in the act.
How long would it take for detectives to identify the unassuming, unsuccessful Ronald Dominique as the perpetrator of a string of killings?
He was the most unthreatening individual I could think of.
He didn't look like someone that you would consider a serial killer, someone capable of killing 23, grown men.
In 1998, with 6 unsolved murders on their books so far, cops had no idea that Dominique even existed. This meant they were powerless to stop the bloodshed as it continued, unabated.
It just got to where the interval in between murders became smaller and smaller, like he needed it more often.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
In the summer of 1999, the bodies of Manuel Reed, Angel Meja, and Mitchell Johnson were all found in and around Kenner, the main city in Jefferson Parish. The victims had been strangled. One had injuries consistent with having been sexually assaulted.
Was it someone that was comfortable in his environment, that, didn't care to be caught? Or was he just good enough to get away with it?
The killer did make mistakes. An autopsy on Manuel Reed found DNA. But it was not enough to snare the perpetrator. Once again, there was no match found on the national database. But that did not mean that the attacker was unknown to the criminal justice system. Detectives would one day discover a troubling record of violent crime and a possible motive behind the murders. In 1993, aged 29 years old, Ronald Dominique moved out of his mother's home and into his own place, or almost his own place.
He lived on his sister's property in a trailer in the front yard.
He was in control. This is the beginnings of somebody who wants to take control of their life.
A decade later, investigators would learn that, shortly after moving in, Dominique's new trailer home was the scene of an alleged rape. After luring a man there with the promise of drugs, Dominique handcuffed him and was said to have raped him at gunpoint before releasing him into the dark street. The man went to the police. They decided not to investigate. 3 years later, another man attended Thibodaux Police Department, claiming he'd been attacked in similar fashion.
The story goes that it was at his sister's house and that the victim jumped out the window and ran away yelling.
Questioned, Dominique insisted that on both occasions he and the men had had consensual sex, after which they had tried to rob him, forcing him to pull a gun to defend himself. This time, Dominique was not believed.
He was arrested. I think he spent 3 months in jail, but that they never followed through with the case because they could never locate the victim again.
While incarcerated, an incident occurred that investigators would later conclude had had a profound impact on Dominique's future actions.
They put Dominique in jail, and while he was in jail, he was brutalized.
violently raped by another inmate, Ronald Dominique was left with lasting injuries.
According to the police reports, Dominic feared going back to jail.
So he came up with this plan wherein he would rape these men and then he would strangle them so there'd be no one to testify against him and he wouldn't have to go back to jail. I
don't think Ronald Dominique is a high IQ person. I really don't. I think he's a simple person that had a simple plan. How he came up with the actual thought, the killing of someone, I don't think the killing was the motive. I think it was the sex act that was his motive.
What strikes me as sort of unfortunate is that he felt the only way he could become intimate with someone else was by holding them at gunpoint, tying them up, and then forcing himself on them.
Something happened to him that, whether or not it was a sexual fantasy or it was some kind of something else that got him to come up with this, plan and scheme that if he wanted to have sex with a male, they either had to, he was intimidated and couldn't do it on his own. He had to kill him first.
I think in the beginning, he killed as a way to avoid prison, but it escalated to where he really enjoyed the entire process from the rape to the murder. It just got to where the interval in between murders became smaller and smaller, like he needed it more often.
One of the things that's surprising was the fact that he was able to not only strangle these people, the strength that took, but also to pick up the bodies, put them in his vehicle, and then take them someplace and dispose of them. I was trying to figure out how he could do that because he didn't strike me as being that strong of an individual, even though the victims weren't that big. They probably weighed 145 pounds, somewhere around there. And then it dawned upon me that he probably had a big adrenaline rush when he was doing this. And that may have had some play in why he did it and why he was able to move bodies around and that sort of thing.
At the turn of the millennium, having been responsible for the deaths of 9 innocent men, Ronald Dominique was still flying below the radar of law enforcement in southern Louisiana. And as the community got back to work after the winter holidays, another victim was discovered.
It seemed like every time we turned around, there was another body.
23-year-old Michael Vincent had been dumped on a barbed wire fence. He had rope marks on his wrists. So far, so familiar, but with Vincent there was something new. While the first 9 bodies had been found in the parishes neighboring the city of New Orleans, Jefferson and St. Charles, Vincent was discovered 40 miles south in La Fourche.
We kind of thought of these as 2 different series of homicides. You had the 9 victims that were here in Metro New Orleans, and then all of a sudden, Metro New Orleans doesn't get any more of these dumped bodies of the same, type victim. They all started coming down several miles in lower Louisiana, in and around the city of Homer.
For detectives, it was a race against time to stop a killer, one where they always seemed to be 2 steps behind.
Working, day and night trying to develop a suspect, only, to wake up the next morning to, we have another victim.
Then, all of a sudden, the murders came to an end. For almost 3 years, there were no more bodies. But in October 2002, that changed. Kenneth Randolph Jr., Anoka Jones, Detrell Woods.
I remember Detrell Woods just because I was there. I remember he was young. Dominique dumped him with his bicycle in a sugarcane field out behind a church. And it was summer and it was hot. And he'd been there and it wasn't a pleasant scene. I remember going to his house and talking to his parents after he was found. And there was a lot of family there and a lot of heartache.
18 months passed before another flurry of disturbing deaths. Larry Matthews, Michael Barnett, Leon Lorette. All men who were down on their luck killed and their bodies disposed of along the bayous of sprawling Terrebonne Parish over a 6-month period. Still no suspects, and the rate of murders picked up the pace. In April 2005, 2 more bodies turned up in the city of Homer. The first was 31-year-old August Watkins, a homeless man. An autopsy failed to establish the cause of death.
He would dump them. It might be a sugarcane field, it might be under an overpass, it might be in a ditch. They weren't always found right away because these were really remote places. In South Louisiana, in the summertime, in the heat, and the daily rains, it would degrade a body, it would degrade a dump site pretty quickly. So there wasn't always DNA to find. I know that in one case, he dumped a body in an unused mini storage. He closed the door, and it was days before they found that one. It was a very nasty crime scene by the time they did find it. So there was no DNA there.
No gunshot wounds. They were all, strangled, some form.
Days later, Kurt Michael Cunningham, 23 years old and one of 9 siblings, was discovered dead, restrained and strangled. Law enforcement realized they needed to act with urgency to prevent further tragedy.
The task force was put together when they realized that we have these dead people that all have a common denominator in that they have been tied up. And they figured out that it was happening in these jurisdictions.
Well, we formalized the task force in May of 2005. We had the Attorney General's office, the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab, probation and parole working it.
With 18 unsolved murders, investigators had to work out what was relevant and what were red herrings in the evidence that they had.
The media were talking about some were found with missing a shoe. Some had no shoes, and they were trying to say that that was the trophy that this killer was keeping, was a shoe.
We think he just didn't finish dressing them, but that's what first caused us to link some things together. They were found without shoes, and a lot of them were found without shoes.
At the Homer Police Department, a special incident room was set up to focus on catching a serial killer.
From 1998 to 2005, we had the 9 here in Metro New Orleans, and then the ones coming up in Lafourche and Terrebonne. So we probably had somewhere around 19, and it was full, 8.5 by 11 printouts of the mugshot of a person's head. And every time we would find one, another victim would go on.
Within 6 weeks of the task force launching their investigation, another body had been found, 34-year-old Alonzo Hogan.
It was overwhelming at the time. We would get working, leads and people calling in, giving us some kind of tip. We're trying to find a certain type of descriptive, a male, white guys, black guys of different ages.
Progress was agonizingly slow.
That was the frustrating part that was, kind of early on and kind of still over. Just the number of victims is the hardest thing.
How long would it be before detectives hit a breakthrough? And how many more young men would die in the meantime?
The thing that brought it all down was when Ricky Wallace, who, if memory serves, his street name was Motormouth, told his parole officer that some dude had tried to tie him up.
On August 16th, the remains of 17-year-old Wayne Smith were found. His body, dumped in a bayou, was so badly decomposed that a cause of death was never determined. It was yet another blow for detectives, another face on their whiteboard. And then nature intervened to frustrate them further. Hurricane Katrina made landfall.
Katrina hit, and everything just kind of went crazy.
So we kind of had to slow down a little bit because duties, were spread all over the place at that time.
A lot of those people from New Orleans evacuated to Houma. We had, in just a few days, what officials compared to 10 years worth of growth in Houma. Our infrastructure wasn't up to it, so there was a lot of that going on. And we weren't really impacted in the way of storms by Katrina, but just a few weeks later, Rita came through, and it did have a lot of damage locally. And so the communities were trying to recover from that.
As the cleanup from a devastating hurricane season continued, the task force tried a new strategy.
In the task force meetings, we knew the perp wasn't 100% successful in one contact, one kill. Whoever's doing this is not 100% successful. Every contact with a person is going to end up with a victim. So we were, and that's where the probation and parole aspect came in. So we had the probation and parole agents, when they met with, the people they were supervising, they would ask, is anything out of the ordinary happening in and around this area?
As detectives hoped that tips would come in from men on probation, 40-year-old Chris DeVille went missing. He'd been trying to hitchhike out of Napoleonville after the devastation caused by the hurricane. On October 14th, his body was found dumped in a cane field. Less than a month later, another victim, Nicholas Pellegrin, 21. After Nicholas's murder in 2005, there was a long period of quiet from the Bayou serial killer. Cops wondered if he had simply stopped killing, or perhaps his modus operandi had changed. Maybe he had begun hiding the bodies of his victims rather than leaving them out in the open.
How many more went unreported, went undiscovered? How many more are buried somewhere, discarded perhaps in a more organized way in the bayou? We know that Katrina was so destructive that there were bodies lying around the bayou. It wouldn't have been uncommon to come across a body that was exposed to the elements.
In October that year, 27-year-old Thibodaux resident Christopher Sutterfield was found dead. He'd been beaten and strangled. Weeks later, a breakthrough in the investigation. In November 2006, a man called Ricky Wallace, living in East Houma, southwest of New Orleans, visited his probation officer with a story.
The story was that a white guy in a pickup truck that approached him while he was walking down the street said he, had a family member that was a victim of abuse, showed a picture of, we later learned that it was a family member of the perpetrator he was using and lured him in where she will pay you for sex. She's a domestic violence victim. She's afraid of men.
As a matter of fact, I believe it was his niece's photograph that he used to entice some of the men to come to his place. That was the photograph he used to say, look, my wife wants to have sex with you, here's what she looks like.
The person that told us this story actually got into the pickup truck with the perpetrator, actually let him bring him to a trailer. And once he got into the trailer, he said, well, before the girl comes in, being that she's afraid of men, I have to tie you up.
And he said, there's no way I'm gonna do that.
And that's when he kind of changed his tune about, you're not tying me up. You're gonna bring me back wherever you picked me up from.
Well, he was on parole. So the next time he saw his parole officer, he says, look, the weirdest thing just happened to me.
Detectives wanted to know more from Ricky Wallace. They had to find out if the man who had tried to tie him up could be responsible for the deaths of 23 men.
And he was able to identify and show us, where this trailer was located.
The address was on Bayou Blue Road, Houma, opposite a cluster of rusting industrial units.
Came up with all the residents there, and Ronald Dominique kind of stood out as being a male that we didn't think was married. He lived on his sister's property in a trailer in the front yard. After that, we started some surveillance on him, and it didn't amount to anything because he worked at a oil field supply company doing some kind of just manual labor. And other than that, didn't really have a life. He didn't leave the house, didn't go to bars, didn't frequent anywhere. He would just sit at home. So we still didn't have anything to tie him into these bodies.
Dominique didn't strike anyone as a man capable of overpowering fit young men, let alone killing them in cold blood.
let's put it this way, he wasn't scary. Wouldn't scare anyone. And kind of taken aback by how someone that looked like he did would be capable of committing all these offenses that he was accused of.
He's not a tall guy. What is he, about 5'5"? He's obese. He's not very imposing physically. He doesn't look like the kind who could take on a grown man and come out on top.
His demeanor was rather a passive demeanor. You know, there wasn't anything threatening about him. Well, what did he do positive in the community? Well, he called bingo. He might have helped some neighbors with groceries or mow their lawn.
He looked like just some little guy that really had nothing going for him.
He had a bad heart, fat and flabby. There was nothing physically about him that would make you think that this person was capable of killing anyone at all with his hands.
If you look at a lot of serial killers through the years, they don't stand out. They fit in well. This guy fit in well at what he did. I mean, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything to call attention to himself. He never got in many arguments, with the sister, with anybody else in the community. He kind of just stayed alone.
What detectives could prove was a curious pattern in where the bodies had been found and when. Released from jail in November 1996, Dominique had returned to the trailer in his older sister's yard.
We realized that the sister lived right here in St. Charles Parish, within a few hundred feet of the St. Charles Parish homicides. The 3 bodies, where they were dumped in St. Charles Parish.
The next 6 victims were also found within a couple of miles of Dominique's trailer. In the winter of 2002 into 2003, the siblings relocated to the Bayou Blue, a working-class community bordering the city of Homer. When the family moved south, so did the location of the bodies being discarded by the roadside.
So all the homicides moved at the same time. This family moved, and Dominique followed them to live on his sister's property.
It was a striking coincidence, but not enough to prove that Dominique was a killer. The cops needed more.
He wasn't in the system. We knew he was arrested previously, accused of raping a male. So he was high on our radar with just that, but didn't have anything to connect him, with the crimes in itself. So we made the decision to approach him and interview him and ask him that. We're investigating a bunch of crimes where we have victims being dumped on the side of the road, and we're running down everyone that had an arrest, in Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish. So we just sent, 2 people to make contact with him, one female investigator from Lafourche Parish and one from a male from Jefferson Parish. And they interviewed him, and he answered questions, wouldn't admit to anything, but did consent to a buccal swab, which is a swab of his saliva.
They asked him for DNA, he gave it. I mean, he knew they were looking at him. I don't know why he didn't say no. Some of the early cases, they weren't able to get DNA because of them being out in the elements. You throw somebody in a watery ditch, you're not going to get any DNA. So it was the later cases that they were able to get DNA from.
Dominique may not have fully grasped the fact that he was the prime suspect. In fact, the only suspect in 23 homicides. And whilst the DNA swab was processed, cops needed to make sure that that number did not rise.
We had the FBI, their surveillance team actually was assigned to it, where that's what they do. So 24 hours a day, we had someone, watching him in his residence. And it is, yes, it's binoculars, it's, it may be cars on the ground, people walking, even aircraft in the air, if it was mobile. Because at that point, when we identified the killer, there was not going to be any other victims.
In late November 2006, the task force heard from their crime lab about the DNA swab taken from Ronald Dominique.
The match was made with one of the Kenner cases.
Manuel Reed found in a garbage dumpster in Kenner in 1999. They would also find a match with semen found on the body of 27-year-old Oliver LeBanks, discovered partially clothed on the outskirts of New Orleans in 1998. The evidence against Dominique was building.
When he realized that the police were following him and that his arrest was probably imminent, he left there and he moved into the bunkhouse, which is a homeless shelter there in downtown Houma. He didn't want her to have to be exposed to that.
And that's why when we arrested him, he was in a boarding house, in the city of Houma.
What would a suspected serial killer say when confronted with hard evidence?
He would pick people up on Bourbon Street near the gay bar. He would see them riding their bicycle down the road. He would just go out between 10 and 2, and whoever he came across, if they got in the truck.
Ronald Dominique didn't resist arrest or try to evade detectives. In fact, the officers who cornered their suspect in the Houma bunkhouse on December 1st, 2006, found it hard to believe they'd got the right man.
2 weeks before he was arrested, he killed Sutterfield, according to the police. He was able to subdue, tie up, and rape a full-grown man, and then drag his body to where he dumped it. Then when he was arrested, he has a cane and he can't even walk upright. He's having to be helped into the car by 2 officers.
But any doubts in officers' minds evaporated as soon as the man in their custody sat down in an interview room.
Well, they had Ronald Dominique in interrogation, and I just remember that it was like the floodgates open. He just kept talking and talking and talking.
He didn't seem to be holding anything back.
And he provided details of all these murders.
Early on, when his initial encounters, I really think, weren't going to result in a killing, unless something in his conversation, his interaction with some of these people, he felt uncomfortable.
The first victim, Dominique's victim, which was an individual he picked up in the French Quarter for the purposes of having sex. They went to a remote area, had sex, but the victim was apparently pretty rough on Ronald, and Ronald complained about it, and the guy still kept on doing so. Ronald struck him in the head with a tire iron.
Once he knocked him out, realized that he doesn't have to deal with this pressure or problem anymore.
And then I think he strangled him.
Having dumped the man's body by the roadside and realizing pretty soon that no one suspected him of any crime, Dominique realized he could have sex with men in a way that meant he was in control.
The early victims he would meet in an automobile. The crime was committed in an automobile. He would strangle him with either seatbelt.
Power, again, control, but such low self-esteem to think that the only way he could be close to someone was through this mechanism.
He would cruise, go to areas where street people, hustlers would frequent. Stop, talk to them, make a determination. If they said yes, they'd say, come on, get in. He would drive them to his trailer, and he would say, well, look, I don't want you to hurt me, so in order to not be hurt, I want to tie you up before we have sex. And those who agreed to do it were tied up. Then he would have sex with them and then strangle them and then dispose of the body.
If he thought they were heterosexual, he had a picture of an attractive woman who would say was his girlfriend or his wife, and he'd offer them money to come back and have sex with this woman.
And he would use his niece's picture because she was an attractive young lady.
He would say that she was shy and that she had been hurt in the past. So the deal was that if you let me tie you up, and she will have sex with you and then I'll pay you the money. And if the guy said, no ma'am, I'm not interested, he let him go. If he agreed to be tied up, he'd rape him and strangle him.
In Terrebonne Parish, where he'd been arrested, Dominique was charged with 8 murders. He confessed to them all, and prosecutors demanded the maximum penalty. Tasked with saving his client from execution, Richard Gawley made a deal.
We discussed the ins and outs of the case and came to the realization that trying 8 capital cases in that parish alone would be burdensome not only on the parish's finances, but also on the families of the victims.
It would be decades before this would be over. The families would have to go through the trial over and over. They would have to hear all these horrendous details of what happened to their loved ones. And they were not about hearing those gory details.
The victims' families agreed to allow Dominique to take a plea.
He pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, to avoid the death penalty.
Ronald Dominique was sentenced to life in prison without parole for each of the 8 murders.
I mean, 8 consecutive life sentences, that's one after the other. That's what you give a cat.
There's no need to waste the resources, to prosecute him anywhere else. We just have open warrants for him if he ever does, try to get out.
Each of them had a family that loved them and cared about them. These were people that were hurting. In spite of the fact that their loved ones might have been homeless and street hustlers or whatever, they still loved them. And they were angry at what happened.
This is a serial killer you've never heard of. He was prolific. He got away with it for 10 years. And nobody knows who he is. These are somebody's children, and they were raped and dumped in mini storages and sugarcane fields and under overpasses. They deserve better.
As Dominique lives out the rest of his days behind bars, investigators reflect on what finally brought a prolific serial killer to justice. His biggest mistake was leaving a potential victim alive to tell the tale.
We knew we weren't 100%, or the perp wasn't 100% successful in one contact, one kill.
Ricky Wallace and his coming forward was what put all this together.
Letting Ricky Wallace go free to tell the story of his close shave was what undid a decade of brutal murders by Ronald Dominique. That was his killer's mistake. A young woman goes missing on a night out.
Please come forward with any information you may have, no matter how small or irrelevant it may be. We just want Libby home.
Prime suspect is a mystery man who for months has terrorized the student population.
I think each time he was never caught. So he was emboldened. He became more and more dangerous.
Libby Squire was missing, presumed dead. How could detectives piece together the evidence to uncover a killer? At 2:21 a.m. on Friday the 1st of February 2019, a student named Libby Squire was reported missing by friends. Just a few hours earlier, she and they had set off for a night out in Hull.
Libby's friends wanted to go out to the student nightclub, the Welly, and Libby wasn't very keen, but her friends persuaded her that she should come along.
She'd gone to, I think, at least 2 other flats, and they'd had a drink there.
It was a bitterly cold evening with below freezing temperatures and fog expected overnight. There was already a blanket of snow on the ground. Security cameras along Hull's bustling Beverley Road would later reveal to detectives snapshots of how the night developed.
Those who were with Libby Squire on the night became aware quite quickly after they left the house. The cold seemed to have hit her hard, and she was noticeably intoxicated.
And that was quite obvious from the way she was pictured walking on CCTV.
It was not a great surprise to them when they arrived at the nightclub and the doorman said, "She's too drunk, she's not going to come in." It was at this stage that Libby said, I'm going to walk home. But they said, no, look, they're very sensible. They said, we're going to put you in the back of a taxi to make sure that you get home all right.
They paid the driver and they gave the driver her home address.
It was 11:30 p.m. on Thursday, 31st of January, when Libby's friends saw her into the cab. Less than 2 hours later, her housemates returned home and discovered that she wasn't in her bed.
When they got in, they found her room was empty, like it hadn't been disturbed since she left, and her phone was on the side, so she didn't have her phone with her.
Her housemates, when they discovered that she hadn't returned home, they obviously were immediately very concerned because it was out of character for Libby.
They set out and visited some of the takeaways that they knew she liked and hoping she might be there, and eventually even decided to get into a car and just drive around a bit, looking for her.
They drove around the areas that they would go out, the bars, other houses that they would go to, just to see if they could see her anywhere, or if they could find her anywhere.
It got to a point where they used Libby's phone to contact Libby's mother and just to say she disappeared and what should we do.
And eventually they did decide to ring the police in the early hours of that morning.
Humberside police launched a search. Meanwhile, they worked to build a picture of the missing student's life and background. A second-year philosophy undergraduate, Libby Squire, was known to everyone as Libby.
Libby Squire was from High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. She was the eldest of 4 children to her father Russell and her mother Lisa. She was incredibly close to her mother in particular.
She'd had a difficult time as a teenager. She'd struggled with her mental health.
Investigators hear that after her A-levels, Libby had taken a gap year and travelled abroad. She had worked hard to overcome her difficulties.
It had taken her a lot of courage to go to university, to leave home and start that new life for herself. But she'd done that.
She was settled and she was exhilarated not only by being social, as many students are, but her family said she loved her studies as well, and so she was throwing herself into it in a very big way. She was clearly bright, she was popular.
Libby lived in a student house with a group of girls on Wellesley Avenue. They were very close friends. The house got on very well together.
There are over 14,000 students living in Hull, and the majority of those do live off campus, and they live in the areas immediately surrounding the university in Newland Avenue, Beverley Road, Cottingham Road, those areas. And they do live side by side with the local residents. And I think the relationship between the local residents and the students is a really good one.
Detectives quickly tracked down the taxi driver who had taken Libby home the night she went missing. He told police that after he dropped her off, he drove away along Wellesley Avenue in the city. When he glanced back, Libby appeared to be walking towards her front door. But after viewing security footage from the street, police realized that something had made Libby turn around and walk away from home.
Sadly, she made the tragic decision not to go into the house. She fell over in the road. She was seen to do that by a group of young men.
It was very cold in Hull that night. I mean, there was some suggestion she may have been suffering the early effects of hypothermia because she wasn't particularly dressed for the warmth. So she fell over several times. She was seen staggering along Wellesley Avenue where she lived, to the point that some students that lived nearby sort of brought her into their house and said, "Oh, are you okay?"
She was very distressed. She wasn't making much sense.
Unfortunately, when she left, she'd actually dropped her house keys. And so she was then wandering, clearly disorientated, clearly quite drunk, around the Wellesley Avenue, Beverley Road area without any way of getting back home.
Libby's keys on a pink keyring were found the next morning in the garden of her house. In those crucial hours and days after Libby's disappearance, both the student population and the wider community rallied around.
There were leaflets being handed out to people in the city centre, and there were billboards in the city centre just to make people aware of her disappearance.
Local reporter Amy Murphy and her colleagues were soon joined in Hull by journalists from across the UK as Libby's disappearance became a national story. Jack Hardy was one of them.
From the geography of the area, it was obvious that there were only so many places that Libby Squire could have disappeared. You know, there was a small river nearby which was being searched very thoroughly by the police. But beyond that, around there's not many places that a 21-year-old can suddenly vanish.
One of her friends at the university organised a search at the university, which 200 students turned up to take part in. The search went on over that first weekend that she was missing, and I think mainly took place in the university grounds and in university premises, just in case she might have been there somewhere.
Libby is our kind, thoughtful, beautiful girl who is loved by so many people.
4 days after Libby had gone missing, her parents, Lisa and Russell Squire, recorded an appeal that was issued through Humberside Police, where they really appealed for Libby to return home safely.
I miss you so much. It's breaking my heart not knowing where you are. I love you more.
It was around this time that detectives had reports of a possible sighting.
Members of the media did track down some CCTV footage that appeared to show 2 people getting into a car and driving away.
Was this a breakthrough in the hunt for Libby? Who was the man she had been seen with, captured on CCTV? In the week after Libby Squire went missing, 3 women came forward to police with worrying allegations. They told officers that they had very recently been the victims of a man in the area. The offences fell into the category of offending public decency. He was a sexual predator. Was there a connection between these crimes and Libby's disappearance?
By early 2019, there had been a serial sex attacker on the loose in Hull student area for about 18 months. The first offence in time was in July 2017, when a woman was having sex with her partner late at night when she saw a man looking through her window. She looked around and she confronted him and he ran away.
One of the offences was on the road where Libby Squire lived. Sexual harassment of young women was not a new occurrence in the neighbourhood.
He was committing offences of voyeurism, that is, creeping up to the windows or doors of women and peering into their bedrooms or houses as they were coming out of the shower, targeting houses generally of the student population. He had been committing burglaries, so breaking into their houses, stealing computers, cameras, electrical goods. But these weren't just acquisitive crimes, they were sexually motivated. He was also stealing sex toys, underwear.
The man had not been caught, and over time, his actions had become increasingly audacious.
By the time we get to January 2019, this type of offending had escalated.
And I think each time, you know, he was never caught. So he was emboldened. He became more and more dangerous.
He targeted students. All of the offences that he committed, we put on a map, and they were all within a couple of square miles. And there's a lot of student accommodation in that area. I would say 80%, maybe more. And I suspect he knew when he broke into the premises, especially at the end, that he knew that it was occupied by students, and he knew that it was occupied by female students, because he would have seen them coming and going.
Word of the attacks spread to both students and the local population.
There was a sense in the community that there was somebody at large who was committing these sorts of offences.
They were aware that there was a predator who was stalking women, who were taking advantage of students out with their friends, socialising, just having a few drinks, you know, and taking advantage of their vulnerability of heading home.
Part of his modus operandi was not just to commit these sexual offences, but was to make sure that the women knew that he had been observing them, leaving behind these calling cards or making sure that they saw him as he was masturbating at them in the street. And so there was a sense in which he was excited by their fear, and excited by them seeing him.
If he was seen by a member of the public, normally 2 or 3 females, he kept doing what he was doing. He wasn't intimidated by them, he didn't run off. He made it quite clear that he had seen them and they had seen him, and he kept doing what he was doing.
Had Libby Squire come into contact with a sexual predator? Was he the man captured on CCTV with Libby? As the search for Libby continued, the sex offender at large in the area was a major line of inquiry. Had Libby crossed paths with him? The biggest question of all, was she still alive?
There are actually 2 very parallel investigations going on here. They were publicly saying it was a missing person investigation, but they were treating this as an abduction.
Identifying this car and its driver became a top priority in the search for Libby Squire. 5 days after she was last seen, a breakthrough. Specialist officers scouring CCTV noticed something curious. They picked up one car in particular over and over again from the night that she went missing, and in the same area.
Police trawled through hundreds of hours of CCTV once they realised that there was this vehicle apparently right next to where Libby was last seen.
It was a silver Vauxhall Astra. Since 8 o'clock on the evening of Thursday, 31st of January, it had been seen driving slowly around the Newlands Avenue area, stopping only to refuel. Could it have been the same car seen parked on Hayworth Street later that night? A car that drove away shortly afterwards, with 2 people inside. Another piece of surveillance video was brought to officers' attention.
Slowly trawling through all of this CCTV, they were able to find a car, they were able to find a license plate.
The vehicle's registration was run through the national database. The silver hatchback belonged to this man, 24-year-old Pavel Relevich. Who was he? What could he tell them about the missing student? Officers began trawling through public records.
Pavel Relevich was a Polish citizen, born and brought up in Poland.
From a village in northern Poland called Warsawice. He was one of 8 children, so he was from a big working class family. And it was from a very strictly religious community. It was a very small place where he was from. It was the type of place where everybody knew each other's business.
He met a Polish woman after he'd moved to the United Kingdom, married her here, had 2 young children. He was an utterly ordinary man by appearance and by achievement. Nothing special about him at all.
He worked in a meat processing factory in a town called Malton, which is about 20 miles from Hull.
Detectives building a picture of this person of interest discovered that Pavel Relevich had come to the UK in 2012. The family had settled in the Newlands area of Hull, not far from where Libby lived. He was not a man who had ever come to the attention of police.
Pavel Relevich had never been arrested in the United Kingdom, and that meant that the police didn't have his DNA or his fingerprints on file.
Never arrested, so his DNA not on the national database. Officers were suspicious enough to pay him a visit. They descended upon his home on Raglan Street after dark on Wednesday, 6th of February.
Very early on the morning of Thursday, the 7th of February, the Humberside Police issued a release saying that they had arrested a suspect in the investigation. A 24-year-old man had been arrested on suspicion of the abduction of Libby. It turned out that he had been arrested the previous evening and was being questioned.
Detectives were keen to find out what, if anything, Pavel Relevich knew about Libby Squire. By this time, she had been missing for a week. Her bank cards had not been used. She did not have her phone. Was she alive, or more likely dead? Even as some detectives asked Relevich questions, their colleagues were making a disturbing discovery.
All of a sudden, it lifted the lid on this secret life that Pavel Relevich had had.
Scenes of crime officers at the home of Pavel Relevich on Hull's Raglan Street didn't have to look far to find something that raised a red flag.
In the boot of his car, they found a pink holdall, which was described as being full of trophies from his sexually motivated burglaries.
Women's underwear, pictures of women that he had taken as he'd been raiding these houses over the course of the last 18 months.
At that point, they're then thinking, well, what's going on here?
When Pavel Relevich was arrested, police were able to take his DNA, and that linked him to this pattern of offending that had been going on in the community.
For Mike Wardby, it was an unexpected twist in the search for Libby Squire.
When they arrested him, they didn't suspect him of those crimes. It was just a natural process. You're in custody. Let's have your fingerprints. Let's have your DNA. They put that into the system as a part of the routine investigation, and they materialised. So it wasn't only at that point the missing person in relation to Libby being missing, but they then thought, there is another side to this.
All of a sudden, it lifted the lid on this secret life that Pavel Relevich had had.
His was the DNA that had been extracted from discarded condoms left around the neighbourhood in the months before Libby disappeared.
He came back as being the person involved because of the DNA hit that they'd got. So they developed that, and as a result of that, they built evidence. They came to us. Decisions were made to charge him with, in the end, a total of 13 offences for incidents in that area, and in particular 3 incidents in January of 2019 where he had burgled a house and stolen some sex toys, and on 2 occasions he'd been masturbating in the street.
Pavel deliberately targeted the student community of Hull, and he deliberately set out to stalk, harass and abuse.
Relovich's loved ones expressed shock at the double life that he'd been living.
To everyone who knew him, he was a quiet and polite boy. He was the type of man who would just avoid trouble at all costs, and his mother said he was sensitive. She said he was so reluctant to get involved in fights, he'd feel faint at the sight of blood. His sister, meanwhile, told us that he was the type of man who didn't really hang around with any other male friends. He would always have a woman in his life, but it'd be one woman to whom he was entirely devoted, and he would care for her, and she didn't think he would ever do anything to betray her.
Relovich's family were to find out that the sexual offending was merely the start.
The police were questioning Relovich for quite a number of days. They got extensions so that they could continue questioning him. And it wasn't until the Sunday evening that a charge was made. And when the charge came through, it wasn't what people were expecting.
We said, well, looking at those offences on their own, they are serious and they need to be investigated whilst you continue to look for Libby.
People were expecting that he might be charged with the murder of Libby or with the abduction of Libby at that point. But in actual fact, he was then charged with a series of sexual offences, including voyeurism and outraging public decency.
And I think the last of one of those was a matter of about 10 days before the incident on the 31st of January into the 1st of February.
Relovich was charged on Sunday 10th of February, but the accusations did not relate to Libby's disappearance. He denied knowing anything about the missing young woman, her whereabouts still unknown 10 days on.
He tried to claim that he knew nothing about it. He didn't. How was he supposed to know where this girl was?
Relovich was still the best lead that detectives had, but even after his arrest, they were no closer to finding Libby. They had nothing to directly link the suspect and the missing student. Frame by frame, they continued to scour hours and hours of grainy CCTV footage. Could they find a shot of Relovich and Libby together? They track Libby's movements, coming across sightings of her speaking with numerous strangers.
And it was clear that, people were concerned, but she didn't take up the invitations to assist her. She had mood changes and swings. She was, I'm crying, I'm upset, will you help me? And then when people offered help, she just didn't want to know them. Maybe she was then thinking, you're a complete stranger, I don't. So it was difficult for these people to provide any form of assistance, so they went on their way.
Cold and confused, Libby sat for 10 minutes on a bench at the junction of Beverley Road and Hayworth Street. Another Good Samaritan approached her.
The police had said that a motorist had been passing on Beverley Road that night and had seen Libby in the snow next to the road. I think the motorist had tried to help her and then had got back in the car and driven away.
At 11:57 p.m, CCTV showed Libby on the move once again, heading southwards along Beverly Road.
Now at this point, Libby is actually, sadly, walking up the road in the direction of safety. She's walking back towards Wellesley Avenue. You can see she's uneven on her feet because she's staggering from one side of the road to the other.
Libby could not have known that someone was tracking her along Beverly Road at that very moment. In parallel with reconstructing Libby's movements on security footage, police were also retracing the footsteps of Pavel Relevich that cold Thursday evening, beginning at 8 p.m. when he told his wife he was going out.
He was out and about on Beverly Road, told his wife he'd gone out running, exercising.
He was not dressed for exercise. Wearing black and white trainers and distinctive jeans, he was seen at 8:35 p.m. at a petrol station. He was fueling up for what police would learn was an evening cruising the streets of Hull. At 9:11 p.m, Relevich's car was picked up turning down Beresford Avenue towards Oak Road playing fields, somewhere that would become a key location in the investigation.
They built up an incredible picture of him cruising around the streets of Hull, stopping in certain locations, getting out of his car, and these are all locations in which he had in the past committed sexual offences. And so we were able to build up this pattern of him cruising about looking for people to offend against.
On the night of the 31st, he was looking for what he described as easy sex.
Police found no evidence from the footage to suggest he was successful in that particular mission. But pictures from 11:57 p.m, the night Libby went missing, became crucial. The breakthrough in the case came from the discovery of this grainy footage.
So the clip starts with a camera that's overlooking a corner near Hayworth Street, and it shows a man climbing out of a car, which is Pavel Relevich's car. It's 23:55, according to the clock, so just before midnight.
By pure chance, he parked his car in the dead end of Hayworth Street, which is a road that joins Beverly Road, almost exactly at that bus stop where Libby had stopped. He couldn't have seen her when he parked, but he got out of the car to go off and try and find a woman to offend against.
And then on the corner, you see a man who's highlighted by one arrow, a red arrow. He is walking past where a green arrow is pointing to where Libby Squire is sitting. So he's actually walked past her and he's walked off across the road,
pretending that he hadn't noticed her, and disappeared just into the shadows of Beresford Avenue. And we know that he then waited on Beresford Avenue and watched. And what he was watching was for whether she was on her own or with somebody else. In other words, he was watching to see whether this could be his opportunity.
This footage shows the very moment that Pavel Relevich chose to enter the world of Libby Squire.
She set off walking up the road, and we then saw him on CCTV emerging from Beresford, not crossing the road to the side that Libby was on, but hugging the tree line in the shadows on the opposite side of the road, just stalking her as she walked up the road.
It was only when she dips off into the entrance to this very quiet and dark, secluded area on Beverly Road that suddenly Pavel Relevich shoots across and intercepts her. They're now walking alongside each other back down the road. He's right next to her, presumably claiming to be offering some kind of help, and she's in a distressed and a confused state, and he's preying on that, basically. They really come quite into sharp focus at around 12:02 and 24 seconds because they're lit up by the light of a bus stop, and so it's that first time you could see his quite bulky silhouette next to her slender frame as she staggers from side to side back, inexorably, sadly, in the direction of his car, which is parked on nearby Hayworth Street.
He's communicating with her, as anybody would be if they had good intentions.
We don't know exactly what passed between them.
There's no sound, so we can't say what was said, but he's then persuading her to go back to his car, which is across the road and just parked down a side street.
Police officers studying the security tapes could not tell what Pavel Relevich was saying to Libby Squire during their brief journey on foot towards his vehicle on Hayworth Street.
And it's at this point the CCTV cuts back to his car on Hayworth Street. You see the lights flash. He's unlocking it.
At that point, Relevich was put off by another vehicle which by pure chance drove to the end of Hayworth Street and had a group of men in it who we never traced. But he couldn't act because they were there. And so he went and sat in his car, with the door open, his feet out on the pavement, and waited.
Detectives theorise that during this moment, Libby lingered, uncertain, just out of camera shot on the pavement. Was this the last opportunity she would have to escape the danger that she had unwittingly found herself in?
There was a car that was at the top of the road which had about 3 or 4 men in who were clearly witnesses who he didn't want to see what he was about to try to do. And so there's quite an odd period that unfolds here where he just sits quietly in the passenger seat of his car with his legs out of the car, watching for these men to go.
The second that their car left the end of Hayworth Street, he was up and out of his car, straight over to Libby.
There's a third section of footage now, which is an enhanced area at a very, very top of CCTV. It's very important, but it's also very indistinct. You can see Pavel Relevich going up to Libby Squire, and you can see 2 indistinct figures. It's being described as toing and froing.
The common sense inference was that he either tricked her into getting into the car or dragged her into it. And her watch was found on the road at that point. It wasn't broken, so something had caused it to come off her wrist, and we suggested to the jury that was him forcing her into the car.
She gets in the car and he then gets in the driver's seat and they drive off together. And he comes back onto Beverley Road.
It was a troubling sign for the fate of the missing Libby. Now in custody, Relevich still denied wrongdoing. Where was Libby Squire? And what did Pavel Relevich really know?
This witness heard desperate screams from a woman coming from the playing fields.
CCTV footage had exposed Pavel Relevich as a liar. In his first police interviews, he had insisted that he had not come into contact with Libby Squire on the night that she vanished. Now, he finally admitted that he had met the missing woman.
He was saying that he had picked up this girl who was looking distressed on the side of the street, wanting to drive her home, and then she'd thrown herself at him. And he'd said, no, I'm a married man, and get out of my car.
He was consistent at that point in the sense that he said, yes, she'd been in my car. Yes, I was trying to help her. She made advances to me. She got out the car. I didn't see her again.
Was there any truth in this version of events? It brought police no closer to finding Libby, and they still didn't have the evidence to definitively link Pavel Relevich with her disappearance. Detectives needed more. Painstaking examination of yet more CCTV footage revealed a car pulling up by the Oak Road playing fields at 11 minutes past 12 on February the 1st, around the time that Relevich claimed he had dropped Libby off.
So there are a few very, very indistinct bits of CCTV which show Pavel Relevich's car arriving at the Oak Road playing fields. It's marked by a red arrow in the first clip where you can just see the corner of a headlight, and then the second clip also marked by an arrow, just the flash of a headlight as it goes past. It's just after midnight at this point, and these are houses that are right on the edge of the Oak Road playing field, so you could see him turning off Beverley Road in the direction of the Oak Road playing field, and then arriving there within a minute or two later, and you can see that's how they placed him at the scene where Libby had been seen for the final time.
8 or 9 minutes later, the silver hatchback left the playing field and was seen driving back along Beverley Road. The footage gave officers searching for Libby a new search area and a new line of inquiry, but not one that offered much hope of a positive outcome.
Once they'd basically searched every area around the general area several times, the river was within about 400 yards of where Mr. Relevich had parked his car and said that he'd been with her. And their investigations led them to believe that they'd been out of the car and there'd been some sort of altercation or incident in the park because they had evidence from witnesses that they'd heard screaming.
We had evidence from a young man who lived in a house, the only house, that stood alone on Oak Road playing fields. And his was crucial evidence because we knew exactly when Relevich had taken Libby to the playing fields. And this witness was woken from his sleep And at 14 minutes past midnight, at exactly the time that Libby was there with Relovich, heard desperate screams from a woman coming from the playing fields.
There was more.
After a few minutes, he saw a man who he would describe as not looking like he was dressed for a night out, walking quickly, not running, but walking with a determination to get away from the playing fields. As he interpreted it, he didn't look back. And he could see him, and there was enough ambient light to him to make out the details of this man. And he thought that it was very suspicious, and ultimately when he did see a picture of Relovich a few weeks later, he was pretty confident that that was the man he had seen.
This was crucial evidence, because this was plainly Relovich attacking and killing Libby and then leaving the scene as quickly as he could.
They'd only seen one person go back to the car, so if they couldn't find her on the ground, the suspicion was that she'd either fallen in or been put in the river by him.
Detectives felt they had a strong case, but without finding Libby's body, they had no proof that this is what had happened to her or that Relovich had been involved. It would be 7 weeks before they and Libby's loved ones had an answer.
Unfortunately, after he had killed Libby on the playing fields, in a particularly cruel act, he put her body into the River Hull. And from there it passed out into the River Humber and out into the North Sea off Spurn Point. And it was many weeks before her body was spotted floating in the water off Spurn Point and was recovered by the lifeboat, the Pride of the Humber, and recovered by the police.
And there were some telling details even at that point that it was Libby Squire. She still had a slender gold necklace around her neck which had the letter L on it. And it was only after subsequent tests they were able to fully confirm it was, in fact, the 21-year-old who'd gone missing all these weeks earlier.
Now that Libby's body had been found, could police and prosecutors secure a conviction?
It was crucial to find the body, because that was finally the point at which they could start to put together a proper murder investigation, a proper murder charge that they could bring against Relovich.
After so long in the water, it was not certain that a pathologist would be able to uncover exactly what had happened to Libby.
We didn't know whether that would take the inquiry any further at that point, because obviously we knew that if she was found in water, she'd probably been in water for 6 to 7 weeks.
Police and prosecutors faced a long, tense wait to find out what evidence Libby's body might reveal. Until then, they could not charge Relovich with murder. In the meantime, he stood trial for the 2-year reign of terror that he'd carried out against Hull's student community.
Relovich appeared at Hull Magistrates' Courts in the first instance, facing these sexual offences, and then he was sent to Hull Crown Court. He always denied the offences at first, and he was set to go on trial at Sheffield Crown Court in August 2019.
It was actually deemed that it would be appropriate that it was held further away from the city, because it had been something that had really inflamed local opinion, I think, and there was a concern that it might not be able to get a fair trial in Hull.
In August 2019, Relovich stood accused of voyeurism, outraging public decency, and burglary.
On the day that his trial was due to start, he changed his plea to guilty on 9 of the 13 offences that he was charged with.
He went on to be sentenced for a string of sexual offences for 8.5 years by the judge in Sheffield, but this was actually reduced to 5.5 years on appeal.
Relovich was 3 months into his sentence by the time the results of Libby's postmortem came back. It had failed to establish how Libby died, but it did uncover revealing evidence of the crime.
His semen was found on a high vaginal swab taken from the body. That was crucial evidence, because he had told the police, when asked about it, that he'd left her alive and well, and there'd been no sexual contact between them at all. And yet here was this finding of his semen on the high vaginal swab that proved he was lying and proved that he had raped her.
For detectives at Humberside Police, it was a crucial piece of evidence. They charged Relovich with murder. By throwing Libby's body into the river, he had hoped the authorities would never get hold of the evidence to see him convicted.
It was at the Oak Road playing fields that it was said at court that he carried out the sex attack on Libby and then dumped her body into the river, either dead or dying, and it was swept out. And he was hoping that that would be the end of his problems. He knew the area, he knew the river, and he knew that it would take her out to the Humber estuary, and then hopefully this would never be something he would have to answer for.
Relevich was wrong. 9 months after Libby's disappearance, he was charged with rape and murder of Libby Squire.
Relevich always denied raping and murdering Libby, and he eventually went on trial at Sheffield Crown Court in January 2021.
The trial lasted 2 weeks. The eyes of the world were on the court as the Crown presented its evidence.
It was fair to say that there was a lot riding on this. I mean, that there had been this long build-up during which Libby's family felt that they hadn't got answers and they were looking for justice.
The media attention was more than I've ever experienced.
And it was tense because, this was a crime that really struck at the heart of the community in Hull, and I think that the whole city really wanted to see justice for Libby.
All you can do as a prosecutor is build the very strongest case that you can. I was confident that the police had investigated this case to the highest standards and that there was a compelling body of evidence to put before the jury. But ultimately, it's always a matter for the jury to decide these cases.
Wright laid out for jurors the evidence against Pavel Relevich.
The CCTV material was absolutely crucial.
Relevich denied it all, changing his story for a third time.
Pavel Relevich lied consistently from the very first moment that he was arrested until the very end. His lies changed over time. He gave different accounts.
He wasn't willing to concede anything or give away anything unless he was very much held to account over it.
At the heart of it, he denied doing anything to Libby. He denied that he'd raped her. He denied that he'd hurt her. He denied that he'd put her body in the river. And he lied, and he lied, and he lied, and he maintained those lies to the bitter end.
What was Relevich's claim about his encounter with Libby Squire?
He had met Libby on the evening of her disappearance. He had taken her to Oak Road playing fields where they had had consensual sex, and he had left her safe and well.
Which must be an unbelievably difficult thing for her family and those who loved her to hear, because he was trying to claim that Libby Squire had initiated sex with him and he was a good Samaritan. He was trying to drive her home and make sure she was safe, and then she had thrown herself at him and he had had a moment of moral weakness and that he'd betrayed his wife.
Would a jury believe him? In court, prosecutors confronted Relevich with a final piece of CCTV evidence.
There was also extensive CCTV footage of Pavel Relevich driving around Hull and walking around the student area, Newland Avenue, near where he lives, for hours after he raped and killed Libby Squire, including at 3 a.m. He was just walking around Newland Avenue by himself. It's thought he even masturbated in the street, which was confirmed by a used condom which was found nearby, found to contain his DNA by someone in the following days.
Taking the stand to give evidence in his own defence, Relevich told the court that, after having what he claimed was consensual sex with Libby Squire, he was still unsatisfied. He had stalked the streets looking for another woman. The jury didn't buy it.
He was unanimously convicted of rape and convicted of murder by an 11-to-1 majority decision. The judge, Mrs. Justice Lambert, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years.
The verdict was of little comfort to Libby's parents, Lisa and Russ.
I remember her mother speaking after the verdict. And for them, the verdict changes nothing. It will never bring Libby back.
The trial for them, they knew, was not going to bring their daughter back. It wasn't about some sort of vengeance. It was more about their need to hear about what had happened to their daughter and to hear the truth about what had happened to her. Unfortunately, they didn't get that from Relevich because he didn't tell the truth about what had happened.
A review of how Humberside's police had dealt with Relevich's offences prior to Libby's murder concluded that detectives had investigated the incidents proportionately. The area of Hull from where Libby disappeared remains popular with locals and students alike. Police will continue their regular patrols, something which locals have welcomed, as the memory of the terror wrought by Pavel Relevich lingers.
There was a real sense of there but for the grace of God go I, in that any woman alone at night could have fallen into Relevich's path and have been subjected to that sort of sexual violence and murder.
When Pavel Relevich picked up a vulnerable young woman with the intention of doing her harm, he believed he could cover his tracks and escape apprehension for his crime. His calculations were undone by the painstaking work of police officers who reconstructed the events of that freezing winter night, frame by frame, from the city's plentiful CCTV footage. And when Libby Squire's body surfaced in the Humber estuary, it provided the crucial evidence needed to prove Relevich's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Relevich had made the simplest mistake of all. He had forgotten that cities like Hull are full of security cameras.